In this tutorial and the next, we will examine the basic structure of semantic propositions. We've already talked about the structural hierarchy on the grammatical side. The very smallest unit of grammar is the morpheme. Morphemes often join together to form words, which join together to form phrases and clauses. Phrases and clauses join together to form sentences, and sentences join together to form paragraphs. On the semantic side, we have meaning components at the very lowest level. They can join together to form semantic concepts, which join together to form concept clusters and propositions. Propositional clusters come next, and then semantic paragraphs. Now, remember, the semantic concept level includes 4 different elements. There are 4 kinds of semantic concepts: things, events, attributes, and relations. And starting with this tutorial, we are going to change our focus. We're going to be looking more at the semantic proposition. And this is a very key, pivotal level in the semantic structural hierarchy because the semantic proposition is the smallest unit of communication. Now, it's not the smallest unit of meaning. There is meaning on the very lowest level. For example, if I go down to the concept level, I could say apple. And of course, you know what apple means, but with no context at all, you might say, apple what? What do you mean, apple? There is no communication. There is meaning, but no real communication without a context. But if instead I say he is eating an apple, now that is a proposition. So we have not only meaning, but we actually have communication. So this is why we say the proposition level is the smallest unit of communication in the semantic structural hierarchy. Often, a simple semantic proposition can be stated various ways grammatically. So, for example, we see this picture here which represents meaning. It represents a semantic proposition, and it could be translated many different ways or stated many different ways in English. John hit the ball was hit by John, the hitting of the ball by John, the ball having been hit by John. Now, all of these statements represent the same semantic proposition that we see illustrated by this picture, and the context is what would determine exactly how it would be worded. So, we look at all of these possible ways of stating this proposition. That's the source text form, the surface level. We dig beneath the surface, and remember, the meaning is the picture that we envision in our minds, totally apart from any language forms. Now, when it comes time to translate that, when we translate this semantic proposition into our target language or our receptor language, we would, of course, look at the context, and we would use appropriate receptor language forms to communicate this very same meaning that is depicted by this illustration. This semantic proposition consists of 3 semantic concepts: 1 event concept and 2 thing concepts. The event is hit. That is the central concept in this proposition. And then there are 2 thing concepts that are attached to it: John and ball. So here are a few principles of semantic propositions. Every semantic proposition has at least 2 concepts, and one of the concepts will be central. So with this event concept, John hit the ball, the event is central, and there are 2 thing concepts attached to it. But you see by these illustrations that there could be several other concepts that are clustering around the central concept in a semantic proposition. There are 2 kinds of propositions: event propositions and state propositions. Every event proposition has as its central concept an event, and it has at least 1 thing concept attached to it. Of course, there could be other things and attributes attached to it, as we see in this illustration. In state propositions, a thing concept will be central, and there will be at least one attribute or one thing concept attached to it. And then, of course, there could be other thing and attribute concepts attached as well. So when we do a semantic structural analysis, the first thing we generally do is identify and mark the events, the semantic events. That's usually the easiest place to start. Events are generally fairly easy to recognize. And remember, events, semantic events, that we're not just talking about the grammatical verbs. Semantic events includes actions such as run, hit, kill, experiences such as see, think, smell, or processes like die, rot, freeze. So with these examples that we have looked at, the first thing we would do is identify the event concepts. In this first one, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, there are two events, led and slaughter. In the second one, they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Here we have three event concepts, which means that we have three event propositions. And we'll look at those, we'll dissect that a little bit later. The next statement has one event, one semantic event. Her singing is too loud. And the next one has two. The man knifed him to death. And in the final example on this page, prayer is the only event concept. Comes is a verb, but in this case, it is not actually a semantic event. And we'll be talking about that example in just a few minutes. So once we have identified the event concepts in a passage that we are going to translate or a passage that we are analyzing, a body of text that we're analyzing, the next thing we want to do is identify the participants or thing concepts that are associated with each one of the events. The participants are the things, the persons or objects that do the action or to which the action is done. We need to remember that some of these may just be implied, they may be implicit. They may not actually be stated there, but remember the picture is what actually happened, and these participants or these thing concepts are part of the meaning even if there is not an explicit word representing each one of them. Now, we need to remember that every event proposition has an event as its central concept, and it has at least one thing concept. It has at least one participant. There may be more, but it has at least one. So with this first example, the illustration below shows that the event is central, led. The event for this first event proposition, led, is central, and there are two thing concepts attached to it. One is explicit, the lamb, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. We don't know who led the lamb, but clearly somebody led the lamb. So we can put that in parentheses. This implied thing concept, the person who actually did the action, we have to state that explicitly as we rewrite this proposition in its non-skewed form. The next event, slaughter, again, there is a single event concept that is central, that's slaughter, and it is the same two thing concepts associated with it. Someone slaughtered the lamb. In this next example, condemned is the first event. There are two thing concepts associated with it. They all and him. So when we restate this particular event proposition in its non-skewed form, it's going to come out the same way that it already is in our sentence. That particular one does not have any skewing. They all condemned him. Okay, two more events here. The next one, deserving, he deserving. They all condemned him. He deserves. And then the third one is death. Again, it is that he die. So he is the thing concept associated with it. Now, when we look at these three event propositions, they all condemned him, he deserves, he dies, they sound very disconnected. Well, they are disconnected at this point, and there is another part of communication that we haven't got into yet, and that is relations. Remember, there are 4 kinds of semantic concepts: things, events, attributes, and relations. We leave relations for later. If we try to analyze the relations between all the propositions from the very start, we will encounter some problems. So at this point, we will just list each of the propositions. We put each proposition on a separate line. We just leave the relations unstated at this point, but after we have listed all of the propositions in a body of text, then we will go back and figure out the relations between the propositions. The next example, her singing is too loud. The event is singing, and the thing associated is her. Now, we're not going to leave it as her singing. That's actually skewed because, first of all, the event is a noun grammatically, and the thing is a possessive pronoun, as if she owns her singing or she carries her singing around with her. And it's something that she does, it's not something that she has. So to remove the skewing, we change her into she, because she is the one that is actually doing the singing. It's like the subject of the sentence. And in this case, that's how we will state it when we are rewriting this semantic proposition in its non-skewed form. Of course, there's more to this sentence. Too loud, that is an attribute. Loud or loudly is actually describing her singing, and the modifier too is further describing the attribute loudly. In the next example, the man knifed him, he died. 2 events, so we have 2 event propositions. Again, as we stated in the previous tutorial, the word knifed may have to be expanded in many languages to something like the man stabbed him with a knife, he died. The next example, prayer comes first each day. Now again, prayer is the event, that's what's actually taking place. Even though it's a noun, comes is a verb, but it does not represent a semantic event in this sentence. So in many languages, when we translate this statement, there may not be a verb that matches comes. It could be, that could totally change the meaning. It could make it very confusing where it's not actually communicating the same meaning. So praying is the event. Now again, as with some of the previous examples, we don't know who is actually doing the praying. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind, the examples that we're using in this tutorial are just single sentences taken out of context. If we had the broader context for each one of these sentences, perhaps we would know the thing concepts or the participants that are simply implied here. But someone prays, or people pray, or we pray, or I pray, first each day. And first and also each day are attributes also describing this event of praying. So in Mark chapter 1, verse 4, a verse that we've looked at a number of times, we marked the events. We already identified and marked the events. So now we want to identify and mark the thing concepts that are associated with each one of these events. So the first one, appeared. The thing concept associated with appeared is John the Baptist. There is another thing concept, which as we go further in this, it will make sense, but in the wilderness is actually part of that proposition too. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, attaches itself to the verb, to the semantic event, appeared. The next event, preaching. Again, John is the one who was preaching. Now, as we fill out this entire proposition, we may also state, perhaps in parentheses, what he is preaching and to whom he was preaching. The next event, John is baptizing, and it would be appropriate probably to include who he is baptizing. John is baptizing people. Of course, people are the ones who repent. Many of these, we see with many of these, the participants, the ones doing the action or to whom the action was done, are not stated explicitly. But when we rewrite these propositions, we would actually state them explicitly. Then, of course, the next event, forgiving, God is the one who forgives people, and people are the ones who sin. So, it's important that we keep in mind the fact that every event proposition has an event as its central concept, but in some cases it may not have a verb. Several of these event propositions had a noun that was representing the semantic event. Also, it is true that every event proposition has one or more participants, but some of those participants, or in some cases all of the participants, may be left implicit, simply implied. So even though every event proposition has one or more participants, it may not, in some cases, have any nouns. If we look at this illustration, the question, did you eat an apple? The response, yes. Within this context, this small word, yes, actually represents a complete event proposition. It means, yes, I ate an apple. So this little three-letter word, yes, has an event. It implies an event, ate, and two thing concepts, I and apple. Now, when we rewrite these event propositions in their non-skewed form, there are a few rules that we need to follow. First, we use active, finite verbs. Using active verbs simply means we will not use the passive voice. Passive voice is a form of skewing. And often with passive constructions, either the thing concept, the participants that are doing the action, either they are not stated at all, or they may end up being in a different part of the sentence. And that is skewing. So we will use active verbs. Also, we use finite verbs, which simply means we don't use infinitives. Infinitives in English are like to be, to want, to come, to go, to eat. The reason that we don't is often with infinitives, the agent or the one doing the action is left implied, so we just won't use infinitive forms either. And as we rewrite these event propositions, we will make every participant explicit. Many of them may not be explicitly stated in the text, but as we're rewriting these event propositions, remember, we're unpacking all of the meaning. We don't want to leave some of the meaning still hiding in there. So each participant, each thing concept that clearly is part of the picture that's drawn there, we will make explicit. And in some cases, we may not know who the participants are, so we would use something like someone or something. And very important, leave the relations for later. In a later tutorial, when we actually start looking at the relations between the propositions, it will become very clear why we needed to leave those for later. If we tried to identify the relations between the propositions as we are rewriting these propositions, we will make some serious mistakes. So here's another example. The destruction of the city was planned well. Remember, the first thing we do is identify and mark the event concepts, which would then turn out to be event propositions. There are two here, destruction and planned. So this represents two event propositions, which we will write each on a separate line. We don't know who destroyed the city. We don't know who did the planning. Someone destroyed the city. Actually, in this example, taken out of context, you could say, well, maybe the destruction was just planned and it didn't actually happen. For our purposes, we'll say that yes, the city was actually destroyed. So someone destroyed the city, someone planned well. But there is one other aspect of skewing here, and that is the chronological order. Clearly, the planning took place before the destroying. So we will reverse the order of these propositions. So as we look at this sentence, the destruction of the city was planned well. There is some skewing there. We're doing the downward arrow on our illustration, on our standard transfer model, where we are unpacking the meaning and we are removing the skewing. And this is what it looks like once we have unpacked the meaning and removed all the skewing. We have two propositions: someone planned well, someone destroyed the city. Another example, John rejected Peter's offer. Again, there are two event propositions, rejected and offered. So John rejected whatever it was that Peter offered, and Peter offered something. Now, when we're rewriting propositions, parentheses end up being fairly common, and within parentheses, you can actually put anything that is helpful to you. Remember, what we are doing here is we are creating a tool that will be helpful to us in making sure that we have unpacked all of the meaning. So anything that is helpful can be put into parentheses as part of our rewritten proposition. Sometimes we might even retain a little bit of skewing inside of parentheses, but the part that's outside of the parentheses should be non-skewed. So John rejected whatever it was that Peter offered. Peter offered something. Now again, we have the issue of chronology. Clearly, Peter had to do the offering before John could reject what was offered. So we again will reverse the order of these two semantic propositions. So this is the non-skewed form of that sentence. The next example, this one is a bit trickier than some of the others. His graduation depended on her help. Now again, there are two semantic events, graduation and help, and each of these has a thing concept, one or more thing concepts associated with it. So with the first one, he graduated, and her help simply means she helped him. The chronology is again an issue. She helped him first, he graduated afterwards. Now, we might look at this and wonder, well, what about that verb, depended? In this case, as in some other examples that we've seen, the only verb in this sentence does not happen to be a semantic event. Depended is actually the cause and effect relationship between these two propositions. So in this case, the only verb of the sentence is a semantic relation, not a semantic event. Disobedience brings much suffering. This one is similar to the last. We again have two events, disobedience and suffering. We don't know who it was that disobeyed, but someone disobeys, someone suffers much. The chronology is correct already in this one. And again, the only verb in this particular sentence, brings, likely would not be translated as a verb in some other languages because it is not representing a semantic event. The verb brings is communicating the relationship between these two propositions, between disobeying and suffering. It is showing a cause and effect relationship between someone disobeying and that same person suffering much. Next example, the compliment was well received by Mary. Again, two semantic events, which means we have two event propositions. Someone complimented Mary. Mary received the compliment. Now the reason that I put the compliment in parentheses here is because that is still actually skewed. Because compliment in this case is a grammatical noun and it still is a semantic event. That event was already stated in the previous proposition, so we didn't necessarily need to restate it here. But just to make it easier for us to understand, we can restate that event, even in a skewed form, if it's within parentheses. Mary received the compliment.